if you were giving recommendations to policymakers in Utah and in other states, what are the key things they need to take away from this new report?
Yeah, I would recommend specifically to Utah is that they could still improve a lot of their occupational licensing measures. They score roughly around middle of the road with respect to the amount of barriers and licenses that they have for occupations. One positive sign is that you are seeing momentum in this. For example, Utah now has universal license recognition, which makes it easier for people who are performing a task in a different state that requires a license to then move to Utah and perform that same task without having to redo their education. The idea there is fairly simple in that, if you know how to be a electrician in Texas and you move to Utah, the electrical systems aren't different, right? The principles are still the same and you still know how to be an electrician. It's not like you move and cross this border and all of a sudden you no longer know how to do that skill anymore. So that's great momentum, but I think, with respect to actually removing some more licenses, would make it easier and more possible for people to move up the income ladder and improve their own lot in life. Especially because a lot of the studies around that kind of show that licensing doesn't actually improve quality or safety. It really just becomes a barrier to entry at that point. And I think also with respect to, housing affordability is obviously one of the biggest talking points in the United States today for good reason. And I think Utah, based on some of the rankings there, could still improve its land use regulation to make it easier for people to build houses and find more affordable housing options for people across the country. Follow some of the methods that places like Houston or Austin have done. That would make it very much more attractive in being able to allow for one part of the American dream, if that is one's American dream, to own a home, making that more possible. But again, there has been some momentum in the positive direction there, and Utah, despite having pretty middle of the road land use regulation, still has a high amount of permits allowed relative to its population across the country. So I think that's a shining point to kind of keep building on that momentum. And I think, kind of broadly speaking, my hope for policymakers, based on this report, is that again, just knowing that there are reforms that states can make. Obviously, we want the American dream to be possible for everyone across the country. That's the goal of from since the founding, is that the American dream is possible, and you should have those opportunities to make your life better and the freedom to make your life better. And given that a lot over time, a lot of the sort of policies or guidances have come from a federal level and been kind of enacted onto all of the states across the board, still realizing that there still is a lot of work to be done that states can do within their systems. I think particularly with this report, there's something across the board for everybody, for no matter which uh, angle you were looking at. If you care really strongly about family policy or child welfare or childcare, there's something in there for you. If you really care about education and cognitive skills, there's things in the report that can you can look to highlight there. Same for regulatory policies, business dynamism, entrepreneurship. If you're a legal scholar or a legal policy wonk, there's something in there for you as well. And as well as if you're just someone involved in community and engagement and involvement, there's things in the report that talk about charity regulations that show like how easy is it to actually start a charity in your state, and that isn't equal across the country. That there are some states that make it much easier to start a charity. There's some states that make it a lot more difficult. So I think knowing that you can, doing what you can given that federal law has encroached on states' abilities, but still realizing that there's still a lot of changes that can be made at the state level, which is why you see vastly different outcomes in terms of childhood poverty and mobility measures across different states. Just show that there's obviously things that some states are doing really well and some states are not doing nearly as well. So trying to fill in those gaps where federal policy makes it very difficult.
Justin, as we wrap up, can I try an idea on you? This is kind of a pitch that I would make to policymakers at the state level and at the federal level, kind of drawing from a lot of the findings in your report, in this ranking, to essentially say that the pitch to state level elected officials should be, number one, sort of embrace and own the fact that you at the state level are leaders and innovators in policies that strengthen upward mobility and remove barriers to people getting out of poverty and experiencing the American dream. So that's sort of a philosophical pitch of we just have to own that at the state level and believe it and then take actions at the state level moving in that direction. And then the second part of that is essentially that states need to sort of convey to the federal government and our federal partners, especially folks in Congress, but on the executive side as well and federal agencies, also need to view states as, well, states are the leaders in innovation and upward mobility policy. And the area I see that most sort of in tension right now is when it comes to social welfare programs, because we talk a lot about on this show. It's something I'm very passionate about, that our social welfare system, food stamps, Medicaid, cash assistance, kind of the works, all those programs are federally created, federally funded, and state administered. And I kind of use air quotes on that because states have to execute on this, but there's all kinds of federal requirements. And so it's not a well-designed system. If you think of a single mom in poverty trying to work and get out of poverty, navigating a really complex system, and it's not a great system for states to administer. So that's at least I see one really low-hanging fruit area where the federal government could say, look, we want to empower states to be innovators, to improve these programs, so we as a nation can get better at helping people get out of poverty and into work-based self-reliance. States need to embrace and own that role as well. How does that strike you with the data you're seeing across the country? Is that the kind of thing that, does it align with these findings? Do you think it would find friendly ears in different states and in Washington?
I really think so. I completely agree with what you said there. I think particularly with social welfare policies, that's where you're seeing kind of a lot of the kind of issues going from federal regulations and federal law to states administering them makes it a lot more difficult, particularly because the federal government kind of puts these policies in place or kind of puts these restrictions in place that one can, it makes it actually harder for states to administer it differently to some degree. Obviously, one of the main exceptions being the Utah's one-door policy. So I think if you are, for example, a state that wants to enact this type of model, I think one of the things is obviously you need federal government approval, and we are seeing hopefully some positive momentum going on there. I think the Alliance for Opportunity group, for example, is doing great work in that field to make it possible for these states to try different models. And perhaps even, if you're a state that if you're trying this policy out, maybe even tried further, okay, well, the state's going to administer it, has a lot more freedom in how they administer those policies or that funding. And then also allow for local officials to do it, their own ways within some boundaries as well, to drive kind of interstate federalism, if you want, in those areas, just to try out different models and different methods. Because again, I think if you look at something like the one-door policy in Utah, you see that it's clearly easier for people to enact to receive those welfare benefits, so that makes it cheaper to administer because it's easier to access. You make it easier. That saves the federal government and states money that they could use on other programs or provide, as a reason to reduce taxes. But also what you see there is that states can then kind of take that funding and try to figure out what else can be done with it and how can it be best administered to where people just have easier access to them, right? Because at the end of the day, having social welfare policies and having, trying to receive them if you are someone who needs them, well, if you make that, basically a part-time to full-time job in order to go through all the different hoops, what you're really doing is, actually making it harder for them to find a reasonable wage job to where they can then move on and, get out of that system. So if anything, kind of removing those barriers to where states can have more flexibility, we're going to allow for more people to receive them in the first place, which is obviously important, but also provides a avenue for them to improve and actually spend less time needing to go through all these different hoops so that they can now have, chances at a better life later on, and they're less stuck in that poverty trap.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.